Tudun Dagan, Adi Nushani Nandiduk, Study Stig, Study Wanadana, Nikanaxo Nasanish, a way to go sted in Zagadij, Duna Hayden Zagadij. My name is Prairie Seminole. I just greeted you in my Rikra language because I think it's important here, especially during Native American Heritage Month, to honor the lands that we're also on. We're here where the woodlands meets the plains. The Red River Valley has been a region where many tribal nations have come to gather, collect, fish, greet one another, celebrate in one another, share in culture and languages. I also said I'm very grateful for this day because you are here. What else did I say? I also said I'm very honored here to remember the ways of my people. I wrote a poem for this morning. I don't often get to share my poetry, so I thought I'd share this. And then I'm also having slides shown, and as I do my discussion today, I hope the images just kind of reflect back on something that I've said, something that you've experienced, because they're almost all pictures from places I've been where I was lost. I get to travel quite a bit, and there's times within my travels that I just take off for a few hours because I want to experience the land and people that I'm in, and it just takes me somewhere, and I get to a place, grab my picture, and I'll go back to regular scheduled programming. But I thought I'd read a poem for you too. It's called Raindrop. Lost. Lost like a birthing rain falling from the parting clouds. One drops beating through to catch in the vastness, and you tell me you are like a raindrop in an ocean, remembering of the fall from a mother who could no longer keep you, in the confusing depths of isolation and overwhelming, lost in yourself as a raindrop in an ocean, asking itself, am I a raindrop in an ocean, or am I the ocean? You said you could possibly be the ocean. You could be this great power, overwhelming and drowning and feeding and feeding. And I know I think that you are more like a raindrop, who unique and no longer isolated. But I also know that you could invoke the force of an ocean, alone, together, united. You are part of the ocean, your bounty restricted within the vessel that keeps you. But what purpose is this vessel? For kindness, for separation, to keep your freedom, or to use your freedom, or to lose your freedom? I could be that vessel. Just as every blade of grass has its space to grow, so does the raindrop in an ocean. The earth and the sky accommodate the blade just as the earth and the sky accommodate the ocean. But a raindrop that it could invoke the ocean, I could accommodate that. Trickling down or drown, we'll stand on our own. For every raindrop that falls, it flows to find a home, whether on solid ground or continue to fall. So let this vessel take you, to hold you, for pains or for freedoms, for unity or for flooding. For peace, you can flood. For war, you can flood. But for what will you flood? This vessel can hold water, whatever you bring, letting you flow and grow as currents change across terrain with either great love and support or with great pain and great war. Even the ocean, a raindrop, can remain. But you are not alone, raindrop. I am here if you want. We are here if you want. So I wrote this poem a while ago, actually, and it was to really feed this need of connection. Because I think that's what lost often is, right? This lack of connection to whether it's as simple as companion, friendship, or something greater than ourselves. And in my life, I grew up in a very multicultural home. My mom is a German Russian, very devout Lutheran, hence me working for the church. He always wanted a kid to work for the church, preferably as a pastor, but I'm not a preacher, so. And my dad was a very devout spiritualist in our American Indian traditions, Northern Cheyenne and Arikara, or the Sanish. And we grew up in a way that connected to something greater than ourselves as a family, but also as a spiritual and faith practice, never once being told one was greater than the other. And through those spiritual and faith practices, we were allowed to see the beauty of not only our own family's diversity, but the diversity around us. It gave us this lens in which we could actually welcome our neighbors and live with our neighbors. As I grew up, even in Fargo, North Dakota, I realized that's not everybody's experience. People are taught to engage with their neighbor in very different ways. And throughout my work within the church and with other organizations, I've had the lens of seeing this hierarchy of human value in practice and how we've ingrained that into our own personal practices, right? That some lives matter more than others. And although I spoke to that separation and isolation, but the value of unifying and being community and being neighbor, living that in action, I really didn't feel it until just the last few years when several people in my family were taken from me. And the reality of how they were taken was because they were seen as less than. I can't get into those narratives because if I did, I'll be crying, you'll be crying. And that's okay, but it's too painful to bring up even now. But what I can say is in a community that doesn't interact with my kind of people very often, coming within a state whose interaction with Native people was, if you see an Indian, kill them because they don't want you here. And that attitude being passed down within that community, because again, they never worked with the tribal communities. They just passed down this mentality of, we're not their neighbors, we're enemies. We're neighbors to each other and those like us. And if they come here and choose to be like us, we'll be their neighbor too. But for now, we're here and they're there. And that reality says we are different. And I don't have to be your neighbor. And so when one of them comes into our community and needs help, but we see them as not getting worthy of that help, and it leads to their death, that's a problem to me. Because our faith practices tell us to do something different. And unfortunately, we kind of fail at putting our belief systems into practice. We may not see it here locally as we do on a greater level, but when I think of children being locked up, and when I think of people being separated and the loss that they feel, who's telling those children, many who speak or come from the 488 indigenous languages from south of our American border, not speaking the language of the dominant culture, English or Spanish, who's informing them why they are separated from their families, right? Imagine that isolation. Imagine that practice of putting them away. But imagine yourself being the one who's doing that to them, right? We do that on a different level here in our communities when we say that's their issue, not our issue, right? But when we start to put our belief systems and our faith practices into what matters, we need to start engaging one another. You might think you're this very unique little raindrop in this ocean of all of us, but look at the good that we can do working together. The systems fail us when we're not a part of them. And I can go back to how our Constitution and Declaration of Independence excludes women, excludes people of color, and calls American Indians merciless Indian savages. What kind of laws and policies do you think will be created for those three demographics? How long did it take for us to get women into elected office or even valued, right, in professions that were dominantly held by men? When my mom got a home loan in the early 90s, it had been only a few years since women were allowed to get loans on their own. Can you imagine that in our lifetimes? How many of you know that? In the late 80s, I don't know what law it was, but it was illegal for women to get a home loan, a loan on their own unless they had a male signer, co-signer. It's totally crazy in my lifetime. And then here we have systems in place and that hierarchy of human value in practice because it's in our laws. And what undergirds that is the sentiment that some lives are worth more than others. I know in the work that I do, it's about aligning hearts and minds. And I like to think that I come into these places gentle and soft. And I tell the stories of my people and how even within our Bible passages, and I know you didn't feel like you're coming to church on Friday, but when I say I believe in this guy called Jesus Christ and what he teaches, and I'll tell you this is where we got Jesus' message wrong, right? And even before Jesus came along, the idea that there was this promised land. For who is this promised land for? When Joshua and the Israelites were looking at that beautiful land of Canaan across the sea, that's our promised land. God is giving us that promised land. And what do you think those of us on the other side of that sea, the Canaanites, the Philistines, the indigenous people, what do you think was just about to happen to us? Now think if we were truly in the practice of being neighbor and community and truly welcoming, and we were fleeing from persecution and fleeing from the killing of our children, the removal of our children, every firstborn son, remember what they came from? A lot of trauma. Going into this new place, and instead of, look at the Deuteronomy text, I think it's 30. Instead of that happening, if we had a conversation and sought refuge and sought community and saw the beauty of the diversity of culture and languages in the land of Canaan, right? Things could be done differently. That's up to us now. And so when I walk into these classrooms and congregations and people want to literally translate the Bible to me, I said, the Bible's a good story. I read it a few times. But I can tell you where we got Jesus' message wrong. And I can tell you that this isn't a literal guide for us today. Because if we're not learning from the leadership from the past, what are we doing? If we're not questioning whether or not the frameworks from the past is working for all of us, what are we doing? My mom takes a lot of pride in her Lutheran heritage. They almost ethnically identify as Lutherans. Any of you all know these people? And when we start talking about our Lutheran theology, because there's a lens of justice there, because if you remember, Martin Luther was really pissed off that the Catholic Church was profiting off of the death of our people, right? They started to monetize practices. We might see that in action today still, actually. It's kind of a monopoly on the death economy in our culture right now. But that's another day's talk. But when we find ourselves in this place where the rules and the laws that govern us do not work for all of us, they do not work for any of us. And it sometimes takes a revolution, right? Those faith practices and how we put them into policies, the crisis around us and how we see that as our crisis. Simple as not using straws, right? Simple as adopting a pet than buying new. Simple as voting, right? What happened to my brother disrupted our lives in a very deep way, and we're still trying to find our pathway from that. And that sense of being lost, more so than just having somebody taken from us, but understanding that it was a system that took him from us and a belief practice in that system. He could have ran into somebody, I hope, in this room that would have said, I will try to save your life. But they didn't say that. They treated him poorly and he walked away. And when he walked away, that led to another trajectory that led to the end of his life. But just that first point of contact, believing that if I need help, somebody will give me help. And knowing the reality that even that isn't safe for me. Oh, that breaks my heart. That just breaks my heart. In a land in Western North Dakota where my mom told me this story, that her family grew up on a farm, and when they put the roads in, they weren't paved roads, they were gravel roads. They made one that went east and it turned south sharply. And every time those new motorized vehicles came in, they often would slip into the ditch. My grandpa would harness up his team of horses, or sometimes get the tractor out and he'd pull everybody out. And sometimes that car wasn't drivable, so he'd drive them back into town. Those are the stories I grew up with. A community that serves and helps their neighbor, not even knowing who you are. But we live in this climate of fear, and this climate of rhetoric, of racial and cultural division, and political identities around issues that we don't even understand. We just buy into those political identities of issues and do not make it personal. But the reality is those issues are personal. To someone like me, who's in your community, who wants to practice this neighborly love until you give me a reason not to. But it's this idea of connecting to something greater than ourselves. I'm still kind of lost in all of that. The political realities of things. I think I have a good handle on what my personal beliefs and faith practices are, and I think I do a good job at putting those into action. But it's the rest of us in these vessels, and how do we invoke that ocean together? And I'm saying it doesn't have to be violent. That's our history. We have a violent history in this country. I don't have to tell you that story. We know it. It's continuing to act in ways today. It's affecting our reputation, folks. When we travel now across the seas somewhere else, oh, you're an American? I want a good rep when I travel. We have to be those folks, and I hope we can get that back in my lifetime. We just have to work together. And that connection to something greater than yourself, that finding yourself, understand it. I teach in a way that isn't about bringing shame or blame to us in our own collective stories. The reality is we're all in this together. And so what cycle are we going to break? Is it going to be a cycle of colonial violence towards others? Is it going to be a cycle of starting to be a new neighbor, starting to be community as one together, or just being a good stranger to someone in need, whether it's a child or an adult or anybody else? These are practices that we have to put forward. And I know that's a risk. Fear is a great barrier. But if we can defeat that fear, I'd rather be lost together with all of you, doing good work, being good people, than anywhere else. I hope I made up my time. I feel like I went over a little bit, but I really appreciate you all coming out this morning. Thank you.